organizations that have a very strong evangelical moral reform component, including, of course, the anti-slavery society. Now, these movements, these people concerned with a moral reform of the habits of the population, were remarkably effective. As you can see, there are a whole series of reforms that are passed as a consequence of their agitation. The abolition of state lotteries, the state gambling, gambling through legislated by the state, slavery, obviously, in 1833, dog and cockfighting in 1849, and the beginning of licensing acts in 1872. Does anyone know what a licensing act is? Sure. Pub hours, indeed, that hours that you are allowed to drink in. A most heinous experiment with the human race introduced. There's a bunch more that I could say here about the influence of the nonconformists at dissenting congregations in the second half of the 19th century. It used to be the case that historians suggested it was these groups, and particularly the Methodists, who had allowed Britain to avoid revolution. But in actual fact, this is just one example of the way in which these groups actually energized civil society. In many ways, they catalyzed a public debate in all types of ways, and their politics continued throughout the second half of the 19th century, trying to remove the disabilities to their legal and political rights. So reforming, for instance, the Test and Corporations Acts in 1829, getting church rates. All nonconformists had to pay rates to the Anglican Church, and that was stopped in 1853. And the University Test Acts of 1871, which allowed non-Anglicans to attend Oxford and Cambridge for the first time. So a whole series of things that they continued to be engaged in throughout the 19th century. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you, however, is that this interest in moral reform, inspired as it was by a type of religious fervour, quickly became what I would suggest to you is a type of secular religion. That is to say that its beliefs became disassociated with the practice of religion and became instead a type of personal gospel. And I'm talking now essentially about the Victorian growth of self-help literature, of guides to tell you how best to act and to be. At the heart of this was this idea, is Rain here? Rain? Oh, poor Rain, that's so unfair. Oh, yeah, she is here. Okay, so Rain and I had this conversation in my office hours, which partly exposed the horror that she knows my eldest son, which is the first time that's happened to me. But once we got through that horror, she was saying to me, you keep talking about this ideal liberal person, and how come, I don't really get it. And I said to her, everybody else in the room doesn't really get what this idea of the ideal liberal person is. You're just the first person to come and ask me. Thank you. So here's my, 18th attempt to try and explain what it is. What I'm talking about is the attempt to produce a new type of person, okay? A new type of person for whom good character, sound moral character, was the critical standard, okay? And it was self-help literature as well as moral reform movements that helped create people of good character. Now, the key figure, or the great example here, is this man who looks a bit like Charles Darwin. If you notice that everyone has beards, white beards, but is in fact Samuel Smiles. Okay? Now, Samuel Smiles wrote this very canonical text called Self-Help. How you can help yourself to be a better person, effectively. And you can tell by his subsequent books what being a better person meant for Samuel Smiles. One had to have good character, the title of his 1871 text. You had to practice thrift. Do you know what thrift is? Yeah? In 1875. And you had to be responsible and practice duty, your duties of 1880. You can tell, I hope, that being a person of sound moral character is not a lot of fun. Okay? And that's the point. It takes a lot of hard work. Okay? And it's not pleasant, but it makes you a better person. And it makes you a more rational person, able to engage in the types of deliberation that you need to make good business decisions and good decisions as a citizen. Okay, so out of this world came an idea that leisure should be, time off work, should be about primarily rational forms of recreation. Rational forms of recreation. And these rational forms of recreation improve your rational faculties and enable you to improve yourself. So let me give you some examples of what rational recreation might look like. These two images contrast life, a scene in a pub, in a bar, with a scene in a temperance meeting. Okay? Now, the point, I hope, is fairly self-explanatory. The temperance movement becomes increasingly popular in the 1830s. It's popular not just by middle class families proving their respectability and good character. It's also popular amongst many working men. Many working men, many Chartist leaders embraced temperance, believing that alcohol was a type of aristocratic plot that kept the working classes in bondage because it prevented them from realizing the conditions of subjugation that they had. It's like Marx's argument about religion as the opium of the people, the same basic argument. But the point of these two images is simply that you have one where there is a promiscuous mix of men and women, animals, children filling up a bottle at the beer, well, maybe gin. And when I was a kid, I was sent down to the pub to fill up stuff for my dad. And the perfect order and discipline of the temperance meeting, where, and this shows its roots in evangelical culture, the set piece of every temperance meeting was the signing of the pledge. This big moment of conversion, where someone would step up and say, I've seen the errors of my ways, I renounce alcohol, I'm going to begin my life again, I'm going to sign the pledge to temperance. Okay? Hugely dramatic moment staged in front of these dully respectable people. So I really shouldn't be so transparent. My other example of rational recreation is the proliferation of mechanics institutes, which begin to appear in all big cities from the 1820s. This is an example from Manchester, which was built in 1854. The Mechanics Institute was a place where you could go and engage in a whole series of self-improving pursuits. You could attend evening classes. You could go watch plays. There was a reading room. There were, various sort of entertainments provided. Another great example, because you'll notice that rational recreation depends utterly on the acquisition of literacy, on being able to read and educate oneself, the creation of public libraries, which begins to happen from the 1850s. This is the interior of the Manchester Free Public Library in 1852. And the thing about libraries now that we all take for granted, even your heinous generation with all your wretched cell phones, is that you know how to behave. You know that library is a place where there's silence, there's order, there's discipline. It stages precisely the conditions in which people were meant to be able to improve their character and to digest knowledge. Right, any questions before I move on to the slightly more fun stuff about the commercialization of horticulture? Thomas.
You mentioned that law
You can't say that in front of Californians who are not allowed to drink until they're 21. I lived in a very small little village where that type of, where there was never a policeman. So that's why that was able to do. Though the drinking age of 18, I think, came in, in the after the First World War. But I'll get back to you about that. Yeah. Rob.
Weren't many developments socially and culturally, when you have a parallel that was a little bit off topic in the U.S. contemporaneously?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Jennifer and I keep having this conversation after every lecture that many of these exact same processes, the temperance movement here is exactly the same dates, exactly the same, essentially the same process. With the same religious character? Yeah, with the same religious character. So yeah, there's an Anglo-American thing going on. Yeah.
My question is, during this time in the United States, we're having like Mormons and starving until you see visions and speaking in tongues, and it's kind of anti, it's almost not orderly or logical.
Right.
So is there
right.
a kind of not?
That's a great question. I don't know if you heard it at the back there because of the traffic. The question was, in the US, you had phenomena like the Mormons, for whom religion was about a super spiritual a performance, and was in some sense seemingly irrational. Yeah. I don't think that there are. There are lots of fringe groups in Britain who get involved, for instance, in occultism and in spiritualism, but they're very, very small, and they are actually, and then, they're not. Katie knows this stuff better than I do. Right. Yeah. Yeah, it is a little bit earlier. Katie's saying, there are all these groups that always think the world is just about to end, like the guy that walks up and down Sproul Plaza, constantly revising his dates. And so, there are those type of people, but they're very, very much, they're always very much on the fringes. And so I tend not to pay that much attention to them. Any more questions? Yeah.
So,
what's your name? Sorry, Corey.
With the creation of libraries and all that, you say they're trying to make the new rational liberal person, but what about the illiterate uneducated? They just forget about that? Great
question. So what happens to those people who are illiterate and uneducated? Well, literacy rates are about, depends